This session is sponsored by the Grand Rapids City Archives and Record Center and is titled A Record of Crime, Exploring the Data and Stories Behind the Mugshots. My name is Matthew Ellis, an archivist for the Grand Rapids City Archives. Thank you for joining me and giving me the opportunity to delve into this captivating topic. I wanted to start with the story of this man. This is John M. Leonard. He was arrested on January 14, 1914 by two Grand Rapids Police Department detectives who were searching specifically for him. Earlier in the day, he had passed a forged check for $35 at the A. May & Sons clothing store in Grand Rapids, located at the corner of Monroe and Lyon. Today, that would amount to roughly $970. The store was run by Meyer May at the time, who upon seeing that the check was from a bank in Wyandotte, Michigan, alerted the police to the possible forgery. When Leonard attempted to pass another worthless check, this time at the Wetman clothing store at 119 Division Avenue South, the detectives happened to be searching the store and apprehended him. He attempted to draw a .32 automatic revolver from his jacket, but was pushed to the floor and stopped from causing more mayhem. Shortly after his arrest, officers raided his hotel room. He had been staying at either the Irving or the Stokes Hotel on the corner of Division and Weston, just a few blocks from where he had been arrested. The officers found a large quantity of blank checks, money orders from Wells Fargo, and a book of blank money orders from the Fishkill Post Office in New York. Several rubber stamps were found, presumably to fill the checks and money orders. On his person was more than $350, today amounting to over $9,500. Leonard gave several aliases when he was arrested, claiming he was M. Reese or E. A. Carter. The Herald referred to him as Reese at first, as did the Grand Rapids Press. Once the federal authorities were alerted, they provided some further information on his extensive rap sheet. John Leonard is just one example of the interesting tales to come out of the Mugshot record. Here is an overview of the program. First, I will give a brief overview of the collection, then provide some basic statistics from the record. After the stats come the stories. We will dive into the stories of bootleggers, a safecracker, and a boxer. And then we will return to our notorious John Leonard. Lastly, we can connect the Mugshot records to other resources available. First, the overview of the collection. It's largely separated into two groups, the book and the fingerprint cards. There is some overlap between the two, though. To the left is the Mugshot book stored at the City Archives and Record Center. It is large, heavy, and a bit musky. To the right is the Mugshot book stored at the Grand Rapids Public Museum. You can see that the museum has Book 1, denoted by the large 1 on its cover, and the City Archives has Book 4. Book 2 and 3 are unaccounted for. The years they encompass are 1928 to 1934 for the City Archives book, and 1897 to 1915 for the museum book. Going forward, when I refer to the Mugshot book, I am referring to the 1928 to 1934 book stored at the City Archives. Here are some details on the City Archives volume. It measures a width and depth of 16.5 inches and is 10 inches tall. Pretty big. The cover of the book is made of plywood covered in corduroy fabric with leather edges. It is held together by two metal rods that screw into the covers. The pages are thick like cardboard, and many of the pages are warped, just due to the weight of pages upon pages. Many of the photos are of good quality and very little fading. Unfortunately, a small handful of photos have been ripped out of the volume, possibly due to an offender being cleared of the crime or for some other unknown reason. There are 2,287 entries within the volume. The fingerprint card collection is similar to the Mugshot book, but most of the cards seem to be typed, whereas the book was handwritten. They are on 8 by 8 inch thick tan paper like cardboard. Unlike the Mugshot book, most of the fingerprint cards do not contain a photograph. There are 10,183 fingerprint cards. Here is an example of the front and back of one fingerprint card for Sherman T. Miles, who was arrested for grand larceny. There is some overlap between the Mugshot book and the fingerprint card collection. Here we see the Mugshot book entry and the fingerprint card for the same man, a William McElwain, and the same crime was forgery. Sometimes the fingerprint card gives more detail than the Mugshot record. Sometimes the opposite is true. In this case, we gain added information from the fingerprint card stating that Mr. McElwain was a salesman and that he was also arrested in 1924 in Chicago for embezzlement. The information found in the collection provides some interesting insights into this part of Grand Rapids' history, and crime history in general. It wasn't until the mid-1930s that crime reporting became standardized, and crime statistics for earlier years are really hard to come by. Here are a few statistics that can be explored: age, gender, nativity, geography, offenses, even occupations. In terms of age, it seems like a lot of different ages were represented in the Mugshot book. The average age was 31, but the youngest age was 14, and the highest age was 80. But the most common age was 17. So on the left here, we have a table of the top 5 most common ages, ranging from 17 to 22, and the most common crimes that those ages committed. So it seems like 17 through 19, the most common crime was larceny. But once you get up into 20, 22, it looks like the most common crime was drunk driving. To the right is a distribution table showing the various years represented. So we can see that as offenders got older, they committed less crime, or were caught less. Here is the breakdown of gender. In the Mugshot book, there were 1,991 men arrested and 289 females arrested. To the left, we have a chart showing the difference. And then we have, to the right, 2 tables that show the top 3 crimes committed by both females and then by males. So females, the top crime was violation of liquor law of 54 arrests. Next was soliciting to prostitution. 41 women were arrested for that, and then shoplifting. For men, the top crime was drunk driving. Then violation of a liquor law, so there is some overlap between men and women. And then the third top crime for men was larceny. Here is a breakdown of United States-born offenders. 1,205 offenders were born in Michigan. The next highest was 109 from Illinois. So clearly, the majority of offenders by concentration were born in Michigan. There were only a handful of states that had 0 offenders. Some had 1 or 2, some had more, but there were 0 offenders from Alaska, Arizona, Delaware, Hawaii, Montana, Nevada, New Hampshire, South Dakota, and Vermont. The top 4 cities in Michigan for offenders were Grand Rapids with 465 arrests, and then Detroit, Muskegon, and Big Rapids. Here is a look at world nativity. So looking at the countries with the most offenders, United States is clearly at the top with 1,966. So clearly a very large share were born in the United States. The next highest was Poland with 83 offenders, and then Netherlands with 44 offenders, and then Canada, and then Italy. To the right, we have two charts that show the number of offenders from 1929 to 1933, both for foreign-born and for U.S.-born offenders. So it seems like both start off pretty high with high numbers in 1929 because that is roughly the start of the Depression. So at the start, it seems like crime had grown substantially and then started to decrease as the Depression wore on. It does look like between 1932 and 1933, it does start to increase again. Here is a look at the occupations found within the fingerprint card collection. The fingerprint card collection ranges from 1913 to 1977, with the last few years confidential due to privacy concerns. So from 1913 to 1977, the top 10 occupations are listed to the left. Looks like the top occupation is laborer with 2,469 arrests. And that could probably be a lot of different things. Laborer could have been a catch-all term, so there could be some variation within that. Then the next highest was salesman with 378, and then housewife was actually listed as the top third occupation at 347. Next was truck driver, then farmer, painter, cook, mechanist, carpenter, and then student was the top 10th occupation at 86. There were some unique occupations where only one individual was arrested that had this occupation, and those I wanted to list here. They were acrobat, beekeeper. There was a street commissioner, actually, who was arrested, a roller derby player. I hadn't known that roller derby was around that long, but yeah, one roller derby player had been arrested, and then actually a magician was arrested. And then to the right here I have a photograph of Evelyn Abrahamson, one of the few women within the fingerprint card collection who was listed not having the profession of housewife, but was a stenographer. Here is a breakdown of offenses within the Mugshot book. So the top 4 offenses were drunk driving, violation of a liquor law, larceny, and larceny of auto. So a theft of an automobile. There were some unique offenses where only 1 or 2 individuals were arrested for these crimes. They were conspiracy, and the male individual to the right, he was arrested for conspiracy. We'll get into that a little bit later. Violation of the Mann Act, which was colloquially referred to as the White Slave Act, and that was aimed at trying to stop female trafficking from across state lines. Violation of the immigration law, there were 2 individuals who violated the immigration law. And then the woman to the right was arrested for fortune telling, and we'll get into a little bit of that later too. So now we can move into the stories behind the mugshots. So we can look at Prohibition. We'll take a look at Walter Quick and his brother, who is an up-and-coming boxer in the city. And then we'll look at the mystery of a guy referred to as Boston Blackie. To the right, we've got a couple newspaper clippings that delve into various crimes that can be found within the Mugshot book. So we've got an arson case at the bottom left part of the newspaper clippings. We've got a 1930 burglary. We've got a liquor law case and an automobile theft case. So there's quite a lot that can be found within the newspaper clippings. We'll start our stories with Prohibition. To the left is Rose Akamas, a short, stout woman who went before the judge in November of 1928. She was born in Lithuania in 1889, so she may have had an accent. She was arrested the day before, on the 19th, for violating the liquor law. The Grand Rapids Press gave some details on the moonshine distillery operation that she was running out of her home that was located on the outskirts of Grand Rapids, which was at 1932 Sterling Avenue Northwest, shown at the bottom left here. At the time, in 1928, Rose was the only residence on the east side of the block. Only a few houses were built on the block behind her, and only a few on the other side of her street. Police raided her house at night, confiscating a gallon of moonshine whiskey, 20 gallons of mash, which is enough to make approximately 12 gallons of alcohol, and 2 complete stills for distilling. One of the stills looked to be brand new, so it was looked like she was trying to increase her operation. Rose's sentence was 90 days in the county jail. Her mugshot record does not give much information, and one piece of information was slightly incorrect. Under married, the mugshot record states that no, she was not married, but it should have listed her as a widower. The book does elsewhere for other widowers, but for some reason not for Rose. Her husband was Joseph Akamas, whose last name was actually shortened when he moved to the United States from Akamavicius, which is just about the coolest last name I've ever heard. Joseph had built the house at 1932 Sterling, but a year afterward he died of kidney complications, leaving Rose to raise their daughter, Hedwig, alone. This loss may have pushed Rose to turn towards violating the liquor law as a way to provide for herself and for her daughter. This seems to be the only time Rose was arrested, which is common among many liquor law violators. By March 1929, she was out of jail, and 2 years later, she had remarried. Moving to the newspaper clippings on the right, they document some troubles that the courts and law enforcement agents had in processing liquor law cases. While alcohol consumption was never legal, it was illegal to manufacture, transport, and sell. So we can see that Rose Akamas violated the law for manufacturing and possibly selling liquor, but sometimes the line wasn't so clear, such as the 2 cases described in the clipping. They describe some dubious actions taken by dry law agents. At the home of George Routsaw, an agent, who was assisted by a woman and a police officer, seized 70 bottles of beer from the home. The case was dropped, however, when it came to light that the agent had forced the Routsaw family to take a dollar bill for 6 bottles of beers they had freely given to the woman after the woman had pleaded with them that she needed the bottles for a sick child. Apparently beer for medical purposes was allowed. But as soon as the agent forced the family to take the dollar bill, they became offenders of the liquor law for selling alcohol. Well, the judges, lawyers, and juries all thought that these tactics to make the family offenders was technically, by a technicality, was not going to fly. So they dropped the case, and the agent was actually fired. The other case, that against John Boheis, was also dismissed. The article does not state why, but the judge, when he dismissed the case, stated, "There are other and more respectable ways of apprehending violators than through fraud, misrepresentation, trickery, and chicanery." So there may have been some trickery by the agents, which led to the arrest of John Boheis as well. This is Walter Quick. Quick was arrested on February 26, 1915, when he was 22 years old. He rented a room at 1339 Davis Avenue Northwest and was arrested while walking on Leonard Avenue. Walter's family had already seen a lot of hardship prior to his arrest, and he may have felt desperate. 2 years before Walter's arrest, his father had died by suicide. Walter's brother Charles, nicknamed Shorty, had been arrested the year before Walter. Charles's arrest was odd, He had killed a man, but it was only until a coroner's court jury found him responsible for the murder that he was able to be tried for the murder. Michigan abolished the coroner's position in 1953, but before that, the coroner acted as a sort of medical examiner with the added power to call grand juries and issue subpoenas. John B. Hilliker was the coroner for Charles's case. The details of the case were confusing, and there were many witnesses. It all started at a bar, the Van Steenberg Saloon, located at the northwest corner of Knapp Street in Monroe. A chaotic fight broke out outside the saloon, and it ended in the death of one Michael J. Lennon. Charles had arrived to the saloon with a group, one of which was already heavily intoxicated. The proprietor of the saloon refused to serve them because of his condition, and as they left the saloon, they ran into another group that had just arrived. The drunk man instigated a fight with an offensive taunt, and soon a large brawl was underway. All the witnesses state that neither Charles Quick nor Michael J. Lennon was responsible for starting the fight, and some of the testimonies stated that both had tried to end it. Charles had an edge, though. He was an up-and-coming boxer in the city. One of his past opponents in the Grand Rapids press stated that he was hit so hard by Charles that he grunts now every time he recalls it. Charles knocked down the man who had thrown the first punch at his drunk compatriot. And when Michael J. Lennon came at him from the side, thinking he was just another brawler, Charles knocked Lennon down too. The difference is that the first fighter got up, while Lennon did not. Quick was found guilty in the coroner's court of delivering the blow that killed Lennon and was transferred to Superior Court. It was during his wait in Superior Court that Walter was arrested. Walter was arrested for highway robbery, forcing 4 individuals to give up their valuables with a revolver on Leonard Avenue Northwest. Walter seemed to be desperate now that his brother was awaiting a possible sentence in court. But while Charles's trial ended with just 1 month of probation for the boxer, Walter received 10 years in Ionia. In 1914, a novel titled Boston Blackie was published by Jack Boyle, an inmate of the Cannon City Penitentiary in Colorado. The fictional character, named for his place of birth and his piercing black eyes, was a safecracker who had spent time in San Quentin. After his stint as a criminal, the character became a vigilante of sorts, always one step ahead of the detectives, solving crimes, helping damsels, and evading police. Books, plays, radio shows, television, Boston Blackie became somewhat popular from 1914 to the 1940s. The Grand Rapids Press had a number of advertisements for Boston Blackie shows at various theaters. Boston Blackie was fictional, but George Davis was not. Davis, pictured here to the left, was gentlemanly, carried a cane, and pretended to walk with a limp. His mugshot record states he was arrested out east in 1885 and in 1891 or 1892. He was arrested in Grand Rapids in 1914 for vagrancy and was banished from the city. The article of his arrest states that he was known around Boston and Toledo as an expert safecracker. In 1917, he was suspected as part of a gang of 6 that robbed a bank in Climax, Michigan, blowing open a safe. The perpetrators were not caught. In 1913, he attempted another robbery in Grand Rapids at M. Brody & Sons at 601 Richmond Street Northwest, this time with 3 individuals. The safe was opened with nitroglycerin, but as soon as the safecrackers opened it, they were set upon by officers. One of the offenders attempted to jump out the window, but was shot in the leg. Davis and his other compatriot were apprehended. The Grand Rapids Press noted that Davis was from Providence, Rhode Island, yet his mugshot record stated that he was from Boston. The chief of detectives identified Davis as Boston Blackie, a notorious safecracker. The strange similarities in backstories between the real Boston Blackie and the fictional version are interesting, but the real intrigue starts when trying to dig into Davis's past prior to his 1914 arrest. It turns out that the real Boston Blackie may not have been from Boston or Providence, Rhode Island, as the Grand Rapids Press believed. It turns out that he was likely from Detroit and was known by the name George Elwood, a notorious burglar referred to as Gentleman George. George had committed a burglary in New York and was sent to prison in Toledo in 1885. Remember that when he was first arrested, the press stated that George Davis was notoriously known in Toledo. After Toledo, he was arrested in Providence, Rhode Island for another burglary in 1891 and sentenced to prison for 10 years. The years and locations line up exactly. What is more, one source notes that at one point he was in Colorado around the same time Jack Doyle was, when he created his Boston Blackie character. Here we see to the left a young 20-something George Elwood in 1885, then George Davis when he was arrested in 1914 for vagrancy, then a 68 or so year old George Davis in 1931. The younger man has a slimmer face, eyebrows a little different, but possibly not yet filled out by age. The ears and nose look very similar, as does the hairline. There's just one problem. Some sources say that George Elwood was shot in prison while trying to escape. Other sources he died a few years later in Michigan. Perhaps he hadn't died, but put on a new persona. Now we can revisit John Leonard. We last left Mr. Leonard in the Grand Rapids jail awaiting his sentence for forgery. A reporter from the Grand Rapids Press came to the jail cell to interview him, and John Leonard revealed that his real name was George F. Rose. He claimed to have been the son of a wealthy family in Chicago, had studied law at Northwestern, and at one point trained for the seminary for a time, but turned to crime when he suffered a head injury that altered his personality. His tale was indeed extraordinary. He had been arrested in Ludington in 1904 for burglary and sentenced to 10 to 15 years in Jackson. He represented himself in court, impressing the judge and the jury with his legal acumen. He understood law enough to petition and argue his case all the way up to the Michigan Supreme Court, where again he represented himself. Eventually, he received a pardon from the governor in 1911. He was arrested in 1913 in Chicago for forgery and sent to the federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas, where he pled insanity. He was transferred to a prison for the insane in Washington, D.C., where he escaped. He trekked his way back to Michigan, where he was then arrested by Grand Rapids police officers. Other articles in multiple different newspapers from multiple cities over multiple years corroborate this. But it was all a ruse. John Leonard, or George F. Rose, was actually a man named Edwin M. Van Meter. His Jackson prison record reveals his real name, the name of his father, and a host of other aliases he had used in the past. He was not from Chicago, but Virginia, not a lawyer, but a cobbler. The rest of his incredible story was true, though. He had really been able to argue his case in the Supreme Court. He really had escaped from the insane prison in Washington, D.C. He was returned to Leavenworth, Kansas, stayed for a year, then was transferred to New York to answer for crimes committed on the East Coast. He then disappears. I found his obituary in 1958 in Petersburg, Virginia. It lists his father's name and that he had a wife and son. It seems that after a life of crime, John Leonard, or Edwin M. Van Meter, moved back to Petersburg, Virginia, settled down, and did become a practicing lawyer. There are many more tales like John Leonard's, like George Davis's, like Rose Akamas's, in the Mugshot book. Lastly, I wanted to go over what other resources there are that we can connect to the Fingerprint Card collection and the Mugshot book. There is court records that we can look at, an interesting Turnkey Record that shows what individuals had on their person when they were arrested. Newspapers, newspaper clippings, both from the Grand Rapids Herald and the Grand Rapids Press, and then also prison records. So here are kind of a snapshot of the court records that the Grand Rapids City Archives has. Grand Rapids had a number of different courts that all sort of had different functions. There was a police court, a recorder's court, the mayor's court, the justice's court, superior court, district court. So there's a lot of different variation, and they all had different jurisdictions. So I thought we would focus on the individual at the bottom left that was arrested for conspiracy to kind of showcase. So he was found in the police court felony records, and his entry is to the right here. And so he was sentenced with 2 other people, and his offense in the court record actually listed false pretenses. And his fingerprint card collection and his mugshot record listed conspiracy. So this kind of contradicts one another and kind of adds more to his story. Next we have the Turnkey Record. The Turnkey Record was kind of like the jailer's record down at the police station, and they would record what every criminal had on his person or her person when they were arrested, because they had to take those items from them and then give them back once they were released. So they needed to document that in some way, and so they had this bound volume called the Turnkey Record. It dates from 1921 to about 1932, and here is our conspiracy offender, whose name was Arnold Adams. It says here that he was indeed charged with conspiracy. He came to the Turnkey, went to the jail on February 25th, 1931. And these are the articles that he had on his person. So we had 1 fountain pen, 1 pencil, and 1 book. Now I'm really curious to know what book he had. If it was a pocketbook, they would have listed pocketbook. There's a number of admittance to the jail that they listed pocketbook or notebook. So this must have been some sort of novel, I'm thinking, but it doesn't list what it was, so that makes me a little curious. Here are some examples of the newspaper clippings that can provide more detail about the crimes and offenders. These can be found online through various sites such as newspapers.com or Genealogy Bank, and of course you can find them through the excellent resources located at the Grand Rapids Public Library. In the middle here we have our fortune teller who was arrested, Elsie Miroff. She was 40 years old and lived at 35 Lion Street Northeast. From the article, it sounds like policewoman Catherine E. Geiser was kind of on a campaign to rid the city of alleged fakers, which kind of makes it sound like there were fortune tellers not alleged to be fakers. The clipping to the left is our conspiracy offender Arnold Adams. The article filled in all the details from the court record. It turned out that he and his compatriots had stolen a car, and the car owner had been in on it and had planned on splitting the insurance money with the gang. So he was charged with conspiracy. The article to the right is of our notorious John Leonard that provides a nice quote from Leonard when he was arrested in Grand Rapids. When the officers finally had him in custody, he said, "It's a good thing you fellows were not federal officers, otherwise neither of you would have escaped alive." So there's some really good dramatic information that can be used to flesh out the stories from the mugshots. And here is an example of the type of prison records available, either through the state archives or the national archives. This is John Leonard's record from Jackson Prison from when he was sentenced in 1907. I was able to contact the State of Michigan Archives and request his record for a fee. The record provided some really great information and actually listed his real name and his father's name, which was invaluable in finding out how his story ended. Thank you so much for tuning into my program on the fantastic mugshot records preserved at the City Archives and Record Center. Here are a few links of resources if you would like to do your own research into this captivating topic.